Let's make a mug by attaching a handle to our form. Here's our tumbler. And there's our handle. Perfect. And now we have a mug. Well, maybe not. A for creativity, F for execution. Hi, I'm Kent. In this video, we're going to make a slip cast handle to go onto our slip cast pots. I've been using 3D printing and my tool Shapecast to make custom molds to make various forms. And here are several examples. I've made these in the last couple of videos. So here is a bowl form. This is the design proof where I was able to sketch out the shape of the bowl. And then here is a piece of greenware that I slip cast. Here is a tumbler that I made. Again, this is greenware and this is the design proof. So these will shrink once they're fully fired. And a while ago at this point, I made this form here, which is a tumbler form, but I'd always intended to put a handle on it. And I don't think a 3D printed handle is going to cut it. So let's go ahead and figure out how to slip cast this handle. The way Shapecast works is you draw the outside profile of the pot you want. It then generates a bunch of STL files that you can 3D print. And here is one for my bowl. This is upside down. It's been scaled up to account for clay shrinkage. It has a slip well attached. And then I went ahead and primed this so it's nice and smooth. This is the mold that basically forms the inside of a plaster mold, just like this. Shapecast also generates outer molds, so you don't need coddle boards or a bucket or anything like that. That basically conform just to the shape of the pot. That's what these are. So basically the mold is assembled, plaster is poured in, the mold is disassembled. We pour in slip, and then we get our new pot. Right now, Shapecast is limited to 1-part molds, and that allows us to do quite a bit. However, it doesn't let us do handles. My goal is basically to be able to do something similar. Can we create a profile and then have Shapecast automatically generate a handle? In this video, we're going to take a first step towards that. Often when I'm looking for inspiration, I'll go rummaging through my cabinet and look at a bunch of pots that are there and use those to get some ideas for what I want. And in this case, I did that for a handle. And I went and decided on this. So this here is a design proof. Just like Shapecast creates a design proof for your final pot, I went ahead and modeled up the final handle so I can get a sense of what it was like. Now I was thinking about this form in particular, but I think it could go with many other forms. And while the beginning was just a tease, the idea is that the handle will be able to be affixed to a pot, something like this. I went ahead and made this parametric, so there's actually a bunch of different parameters here I could change, but I like this for this particular form. I have relatively big hands, I can get 3 fingers in there, so it can fit like that. We can obviously play with how we attach it. So the parameters I wound up picking were the overall dimensions of the handle, so the height, the width, this curvature here, so that specifies the handle form, and then there's the profile of the handle as well. So again, there's a height, a width, and a curvature of the form. So for this handle, I settled on 80 millimeters tall, and then it's 35 millimeters wide. The width of the handle is 20, and the thickness is 9. Obviously, the 3D printed part isn't exactly the same size, but pretty close. So I went ahead and printed this out and was playing around with it. I stuck it on the mug, just like I showed you, and this is a final fired piece, and this is the final fired size. And I think I'd like this, so let's go ahead and make a mold. One thing to note is that this handle is symmetric, so it doesn't matter which way is up and down, and that means we can make 1 mold and 2 plaster halves. I went ahead and started modeling this up, and you'll notice I went ahead and accounted for clay shrinkage, just like Shapecast does. This here is the profile of the handle, and it's bigger to account for my 13% clay shrinkage. I've added in some keys. I've got a wall here. There's some sprues that will wind up being cut off so that we can pour the slip in from this direction. And then we need a box so that we can contain the plaster. This was great. I was playing around with it. I actually wound up modeling this manually, and I was wondering if I could make it more parametric. And so I created this version. It's basically the same thing, scaled up for clay shrinkage. However, I was able to change the parameters easily. And you'll notice some extra features here. That's because this one actually modeled the wall as well. So these pins out here are for registering against the outer wall. So it just slots in there. And we'll fill this up here with plaster. This one is printed on draft settings, so there's some layer lines in here. But this one I printed on high resolution settings. So we'll need to seal this so it doesn't leak. I think I'm just going to use some tape like I used to do before Shapecast. And then we will mix up enough plaster to fill this up, let it set, and we'll then need to do that twice so we have 2 halves of the mold. One will be for the right and one will be for the left. Towards that end, the keys I put into the plaster are also symmetrical, so they should just fit together. We're going to need 2 plaster pieces to make this handle, so we can either use the mold twice in a row, or what I did was actually just print out 2 of them. So here's a second one. Basically, this will let me mix up 1 batch of plaster and pour them at the same time. If you're doing this at home, you can decide how you want to do it. I wasn't worried about the filament cost, and I just let it run overnight, so I didn't have to wait on it, and that means I only need to mix up plaster once and pour plaster once. You very easily could print one of these, pour the plaster, demold it, clean up the mold, and then pour the plaster again. Whatever works best for you. So all these features here are generated parametrically, so I didn't actually specify the size of the box directly. It is inferred by the size of the handle. So we need to figure out how much volume is in here so we know how much plaster we need. So for one of the boxes, so we'll call this 9 centimeters by 15 by 3. So we multiply that all together and we get 405 cubic centimeters, or basically 0.4 liters. We have 2 of them, so we need 0.8 liters. And I like to mix a little bit of extra plaster just in case, so I'll round up to a liter. You'll notice this doesn't account for the space for the handle itself, so we should even have a little bit extra compared to that. But I'd rather have more than less. For my plaster, which is USG #1 Pottery plaster, basically for each liter of volume you need to fill with plaster, you need 1 kilogram of dry plaster, and then we have a 70 to 100 ratio of water to plaster. So we'll need 0.7 liters of water for 1 kilogram of plaster. Let's go ahead and get set up for that. For the shape cast molds, I've settled on this neoprene gasket and threaded inserts to be able to tightly secure the pieces together so they don't leak. This is a lot smaller, so I think I'll get away with just tape. So I have this foil tape here. I just want to close up all the edges. There we go, just like that. It doesn't need to be pretty, but it does need to hold back the plaster. I went ahead and did the other one already. Then I went ahead and used my scale and measured out 1 kilogram of plaster, and then 700 grams or 0.7 liters of water. So what we want to do is take the plaster and sprinkle it onto the water slowly so it slakes and gets fully hydrated. I'll then let it slake for 3.5 minutes and mix it for 4, and then we'll pour the plaster. This part I'm usually not very patient, but I'll try. All right, looking good, and now we mix. All mixed, and then we pour. Try and pour it from as high up as possible. Nice thin stream. All right, looks like we're good on the plaster calculations. Got a little bit left and filled it up. So these, go ahead and tap, get the bubbles out. Just gonna turn them around because this here is the part with the handle. All right, I'll tap those a little bit longer and we'll go ahead and let the plaster cure. It's been maybe 30 or 40 minutes. Recently I've been demolding my molds in 2 pieces. I've been taking the outer mold off first and then letting it set and firm a little bit longer before I take out the inner mold. In this case, the outer mold is this shell here to hold the plaster, and the inner mold would be the part with the handle. So we can go ahead and take off the tape. And it looks like we got a little bit of flashing, but no leaks, which is great. There we go. Just like that. Go ahead and break this edge while the plaster is still soft. All right, same for this one. There we go. All right, I'm gonna let these cure for a while longer and continue to stiffen up, and then we will work on getting the other half of the mold off. It's been about another hour. Let's see if we can demold these. All right, that one seemed pretty stuck. So does this one. Not an uncommon problem to have the inner mold stuck. For my normal molds, I'll use this here. This is isopropyl alcohol and water that's been mixed and put in my freezer. So basically it's still liquid at freezer temperatures. I'll dump that into the mold, and that will basically make the PLA colder and make it shrink just a little bit and get it to be free. However, when I design these, I don't have the recess for the handle in here. I was hoping I could get away without it. So let's see if we can get the bottom to freeze and release the plaster. So I have a tray here. Let's go ahead and put that in there. There we go, I think this one's coming. Oh, not so much. Broke out the inside. All right, starting to come. Oh, and exactly the same problem. Well, that's unfortunate, but not too surprising for my very first attempt at a new mold. All right, so let's take stock here. So for both of them, the inner piece here broke out. I also realized I didn't put a draft angle on the sprues here, so that's something I can fix. The handles also don't have a draft angle. This face here is actually flat, so it might be helpful to put a bit of a curve on there, although that will impact the profile of the handle. Let's check how the mold keys work. I lost this one, but the rest, and I lost this one, which is actually the same one. It's interesting. See if it fits together okay. Obviously we wouldn't want to slip cast this as is. There we go. I'm not getting a perfectly tight seal. And that comes down to the 3D printed pieces often not being exactly flat. And I may need to give a little bit more clearance here on the pins. That was another thing I wasn't quite sure about, if I had enough. I think the answer is no. And these are looking a little brittle. Maybe they're a little too tall. Well, I just went for it, printing 2 of these and hoping it would just work out, although obviously that wasn't the case. However, we're making progress, which is good. My mirrored geometry seems to be working just fine. And now I have a list of things I need to go and fix for V2. Let's try that again. It's been a few days and I've thought about this a little bit more. I think another problem I had was actually using the isopropyl alcohol. I wanted to go ahead and shrink the handle part itself, but since there's no recess on the back, that meant that the back piece shrank as well, most likely, and that constricted, and I think it actually held onto the plaster tighter. I don't think that was the only problem, but I think that was a contributing factor. So with all that in mind, I went ahead and did another revision, and I now have this. So let's do a comparison. There are several changes. One of them is that I added some draft angles, and that's probably most noticeable on the wall here. So this now is coming up, so there's a draft angle there. Also added draft angles here around the sprue. I did not change the geometry of the handle itself, so there's 0 draft angle here. There's no undercut, so this should be okay. And the feature is relatively small, so I'd like to get this to work if at all possible. For the pins and the plaster, I went ahead and changed the geometry there as well. I removed 2 of them. I don't think I need all 4, and space was getting a little bit tight. I also changed it so that it's curved and much more shallow. And I gave it a little bit more clearance as well. Hopefully that will work out in our favor and make them more robust. I also changed the tabs here for the box wall. I made it a little bit shorter so that removing this top piece should be a little bit easier. The last thing I did is I shrunk the plaster just a little bit. This is probably a little bit bigger than it needs to be, and feeling it and holding it definitely reinforces that. So this mold will be slightly smaller as well. And then the other big change I made is actually on the back side. So this one, which is flat, here I hollowed out where the handle is. And the idea is I'll be able to put the frozen isopropyl alcohol mixture in here. And that way the shrinking will be localized just to the handle piece. They say this piece here will contract just a little bit, and hopefully that will be enough to pop it out. At least between that and the other changes. I'm being a bad scientist here and I'm twisting a bunch of knobs all at once. So I don't know which ones will actually have an impact, but we're gonna try a bunch of things. The last thing I'm gonna do is related to procedure. I went ahead and let the mold sit longer than I normally would before I tried to demold the handle part. However, I'm gonna go ahead and let the plaster cure even longer this time. The longer the plaster cures, the harder it gets, and I think the strength will come into my favor in this case, especially given this result. From your perspective, that'll just be another jump cut, but for me, it'll be a little bit while longer waiting. And I guess the other change is I'm only going to do one of these this time as opposed to two. So I went ahead and measured out the smaller amount of plaster that I'm going to need, and I'll just mix up this one batch. Otherwise, it's basically the same as before. I'm going to go ahead and tape this up, mix the plaster, pour it in. All right, we'll go ahead and let that slake. The one other change I considered was actually making the handle part here removable from the mold box. That would let me disassemble the box completely from the plaster and only have to contend with pulling the handle out. The problem in doing that is then I have to seal between the handle and the box itself. With my normal shape cast molds, I use the threaded inserts and the foam gasket to make a plaster tight seal. Here there's not a lot of space, and the critical dimension is really between the handle and this face here, since that's where the molds meet. And I'd rather not introduce any sources of air if at all possible. So hopefully this will work, but there are backup plans just in case. Go ahead and let it set, come back, pull the outer wall off, and then we'll let it cure even more before we attempt demolding the other side. Plaster set, let's go ahead and remove the tape so that this outer edge can start drying as well. And we definitely have some flash, I can see some right here. So the tape did its job. Oh yeah, this is gonna come off real easy. Yay, draft angles. And the changes I made to these registration pins worked great. This didn't get stuck at all. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and let this dry and cure for a while longer than last time, and then we'll try demolding it. Let's see if we have a better look this time. While I was waiting, I looked up the curing properties for this plaster. Basically, after an hour, it has reached half of its compressive strength, and then it reaches its full compressive strength basically once it's dry. So I think my earlier attempt when I was waiting was probably okay in terms of a strength thing. We aren't doing a compressive strength thing here. I'm actually pulling on it so it's in tension. Maybe they're related, I'm not really sure. It's been about 10 hours since I poured this, so short of waiting several days, I think it's the strongest it's going to get for right now. The PLA is flexing some, but it's not letting go. So let's see if we can use the cavity here. So I might as well purple alcohol again. I'm gonna put some in a smaller container here. There we go, filled it up to the top. Normally when I do this on my big molds, it happens relatively quickly, so let's see. Nothing yet. Dump it out. Pull from this side. It's really hard to tell if it's moving. Put it back in for a while longer. PLA is definitely nice and cold. Alright, I didn't want to have to pry, but I think I'm going to. Just a little bit. Alright, it's starting to come. Gentle. And exactly the same thing. I think we have an improvement, but it's still problematic. All right, time to regroup again. I've been thinking about this a little bit more and the breakout we're getting. So we got a little bit of chip out here, and then obviously on the inside. I'm wondering if it's the handle profile itself. This does not have an undercut as designed, but there is zero draft angle. In particular, the face of the handle is flat. However, 3D printing is not perfect, and I'm wondering if there is actually a very subtle undercut just given the way this is printed. Maybe as it's printed, it's constricting a little bit. 3D prints definitely move as they're printing. They're not perfect. So if that's the case, it might be grabbing onto the plaster and causing it to break out. I think the rest of the changes are looking pretty good. I think the draft angle here helped. The shower pins here seem to work okay as well, although until I have two, I won't be able to really test them out. I'm not too sure the isopropyl alcohol trick on the back did anything in particular. For the bigger forms, there's a huge diameter, so just a little bit of shrinkage will have a noticeable impact. This handle form's way smaller. So I think just in terms of proportions, we aren't as well off with this form. The advantage is that printing it hollow like this makes it print a lot faster. So I quite literally went back to the drawing board and drew a new handle profile. And now I have this. These look very similar. However, there's a slight difference in the profiles as well as the shades of the filament, but that's just because I changed the rolls of filament. So this here is the original, so it's flat on the top and the bottom and has a radius here on the edge. This one here has a little bit of a swoop, so it bellies out just a little bit towards the middle and then still rounds off around the corners. So this one here, when it's placed sideways like this and cut in half, will have a draft angle from the bottom to the top. So I printed out yet another mold that corresponds to this new part here, and we'll give it one more attempt. You've seen me mix up enough plaster, so I'm going to do exactly the same thing again, and we'll jump to the demolding part. For some reason, I felt like I've done this before. All right, the pour went smoothly, and the outer mold, I pulled it off. And it's still looking pretty stuck. Ice crystals in this are so weird. What I was saying before about the coldness shrinking the PLA, with a big pot, if it shrinks like 0.1%, because the diameter is so big, that 0.1% is actually a noticeable difference, versus if you have something tiny and shrink by 0.1%, it's much smaller. Because what's happening is it's shrinking around the circumference, which will change the diameter. So here, since we don't have a very large circumference, or the equivalent, there isn't very much room for it to move. That's my theory on why this trick is not working as well right now. Also going to wait longer and go ahead and let it get as cold as it can. All right, so that's been a while, so let's go ahead and try and pull it out. It still seems very stuck. Better, but still no. This inside corner here is really grabbing on. But that's the best one yet. We've made some improvements, but we haven't gotten all the way there yet. It is good to know that this isn't just a draft angle problem, since I've changed those. So there's definitely some other things going on that we need to figure out. I think we're going to have to go to more drastic measures, and in particular think about maybe splitting this into more pieces or changing materials. One of the ideas is to go to a flexible filament like TPU. The problem with that is a lot of people don't have printers that will do TPU easily. Another option is to introduce silicone. I was very reluctant to do that with the regular shape cast mold since they're so large. However, for a handle, it's much, much smaller, and so that may be a reasonable thing to do. I think the challenge with going into more pieces is basically going to get the alignment correct. Have to basically align the mold box, the pins, and the handle form itself so that we can have a repeatable process so that we can cast the two forms together. That means some more things to figure out and try in the future. I was going to end the video there, but I couldn't help myself. I did one more test. I mentioned earlier that the plaster gets to half of its compressive strength within about an hour. Maybe I wasn't waiting long enough and I need the full compressive strength. So this here is the data sheet for the plaster. And this is where I got the compressive strength value. So compressive strength 1 hour after set, 1000 psi, 6.9 megapascals, versus 2400 when it's completely dry. Again, we're not doing compressive strength when we push, we're doing tensile strength when we pull, but I'm guessing that those numbers are somewhat related. So this is another data sheet here, and it shows the compressive strength basically as a percentage of water. And so after an hour, we seem to be in this kind of flat region here where we have most of the compressive strength, and when it fully dries, it starts to go up. So waiting those few extra hours basically didn't really change where we were on this graph. Maybe it went up a little bit, but really just a little bit. So while I was editing this video, I went ahead and poured one more set of plaster. And that's this mold here. Basically did exactly the same thing, only this time I let it sit in the mold for several days in front of a fan so it fully dried. So we should be at that point in the curve where it's basically as strong as it's going to get. And we still got chip out. So compared to the last attempt, it's a little bit better, but this is still far from a good mold. So we have this chip out here and here as well. Again, this is the scientist in me. Before we change a bunch of knobs to see if we get things better, since it didn't work, I went back and isolated that one particular variable to see if that was the problem. Going and looking up the data as well from the manufacturer also was reassuring. So at least I know this isn't a waiting game around the strength of plaster. While sticking the 3D printed handle onto the fired pot with a tease, I guess as far as we're actually going to get in this video. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks.